All right, so we're going to start with a little video. And let's see, I think I need to maybe mute this.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can't hear anything.
There. Now you guys can hear me okay? All right. Sorry about that. I still haven't figured out how to be able to play the video the whole time through, so I might be able to screen share it from there, so I might dabble with this. Actually, if one of you two can stay after class, I'd like to experiment with you a little bit, because I think I can do that somehow without it making it squeal, but I don't know how. So, all right. So let's see here. The video, actually, let me escape out of this. Okay, so Gov is, of course, the lovable guy there, and then they walk through different circumstances. I'll probably try to play another one, but I might assign part of these. I haven't quite decided, but it's a set of 5. My high school students last year thought they were pretty funny and stuff, so I think there's some good things to make you think about in relationship of the government and ourselves, which is the focus of chapter 5. So that's why I brought these videos in today. Any questions or comments about the video? Did you get the gist of it? What they're trying to do or think about? All right, somebody doesn't know how to erase the board. So, any questions on last week's stuff for your homework tests? It looked like your test averages were pretty decent, actually, around 70% average. I looked them up, so for the class average. So that's okay. Could be better. If you guys have individual questions about your grades, always come up and see me, and we can also talk about strategies or whatnot if you want to try to improve. So today we talk about government intervention. So government intervention in the free market. So free market isn't completely free, so we're not saying that there's no government for starters, but a free market in general means little to no government intervention. There's kind of rules of the game set up, but there's this idea of free market for our purposes. I just want you to think about home base. So the free market, for our purposes of learning this stuff, is demand, consumers out there being free to go out and purchase pretty much whatever they want to buy, and supply being a group of companies that are willing, companies or individuals that are supplying some good or service, again, in a voluntary way to try to maximize profits. So we've got consumers trying to maximize their happiness, which is part of this week too. There's only 2 chapters this week, well, I guess we had 2 last week too, but chapter 6 and 8. So one thing to note is that we actually skipped chapter 7, so don't be thinking that we got 7 and accidentally, you shouldn't do that if you're paying attention to my econ lab, but chapter 7 is on international, which we cover in the macro class. So it'll be on chapter 6, which is this government intervention, and then chapter 8 is on thinking about the consumer in more detail. So consumers maximizing happiness, producers maximizing profit, which we're going to spend a lot of time on later, maximizing profit, consumers maximizing happiness. So that's kind of our objectives that we deal with. And those 2 groups being able to exchange with each other comes up with a price that we spent quite a bit of time on in chapter 3, and a market quantity. All right, so in order for the government to function, it needs to collect some taxes. So from our pictures that we've been dealing with, figure 2.5 shows kind of this free market concept, right? Goods and service, we got households over here, businesses over here, and the exchange in the 2 primary markets, the output market, the final goods and services market, and the resource market, the market for inputs. So the government adds another layer of detail because in order for the government to function, they need money. And they get that money through involuntary taxes. What do I mean by involuntary taxes? You don't have a choice. You have to pay them. If you choose not to pay them, then what happens in the United States? You go to jail. It's against the law to not pay your taxes. It is literally, the government will put you in jail. You've broken a law by not paying your taxes. So we don't have a system of voluntary giving, like, oh, I think we should have some weapons of mass destruction and let's all just pool our money together and try to protect ourselves. That type of voluntary collective action is possible. We do it here at the university. The security, that we have that are rough and tumble and protect us from all the bad guys, that's all voluntary, right? The government's not providing us that. So my point with that is that it is possible for the free market to potentially provide some of those things that the government provides. It's not impossible for that to happen. I think in some cases, it might be more by historical accident that the government now provides it, and because of today's technology, maybe the government doesn't need to they don't really have to provide it, but they still do because they always have. There's cases like that are out there. But nonetheless, the government collects taxes through involuntary means. You have to pay those taxes. That comes from 2 sources we identified last time. Income tax, right? Money from the resource market, or sales tax, money from the cash register. When you buy stuff, we skim a little off the cash register, you pay a little extra, or when you get your paycheck, you don't get quite the full amount that the business actually paid you, right? So how does that impact our market if we were to implement a tax into this situation? How does the market, what sort of things change in our market when the government gives subsidies or grants? How many of you have a Pell Grant to be in your seat today of some sort, or some sort of government grant? Free money, not a loan, free money. How many people got some free money? How many of you don't know really what you have because it's some sort of mix of loans and they just sent you this letter and they say, hey, welcome to Ottawa. So That's possible too. But the stuff that's free money is called a subsidy. So instead of a government taking money from you, they're actually giving you money, right? So it's what economists kind of perversely call, because of our way of thinking, as a negative tax. So instead of taxing you $100, it's a negative tax, which means they're giving you $100, right? So we got taxes and subsidies. We can have restrictions like quotas and some other things that we'll talk about in this chapter. And so we're going to come back to this free market each time to look at what the impact of that is. So for next class, if you want to jot down in your notes, I want you to bring, I don't think we'll get to this today. If we do, we can kind of do it in hand. But if you don't have it along with you, bring this sheet, this little worksheet we're going to do in class on Friday at the start of class. And we might start into some of this today. We'll see how far we get. And it's no big deal if you don't have the sheet. You can actually just draw it in your notes. So we'll live either way. All right. So types of government intervention. Number one is a tax. So a tax is typically, well, it's a monetary charge. Monetary charge on a transaction. How does that tax work in Kansas right now at the cash register? What do you guys pay roughly? 7, 8, 9 in Kansas. I think if you go over to Missouri, it'll be a little less than that, but we're running about 8.9%. That tax rate can actually vary quite a bit. Anybody from Overland Park? At some malls, it's kind of crazy. I was shocked when I learned this after moving here. It can be almost 13%. Have you ever noticed that on your cash register receipts? And it might depend on the mall that you're at in Overland Park. Like they got some sort of special deal where they were able to, the local was able to add on a little bit of extra money onto the cash register because they helped the mall developer develop the land in the first place. So we got kind of all kinds of crazy things that can come into play with taxes, whether they're sales taxes or income taxes or death taxes and all kinds of stuff. So typically we have the sales tax. So example, sales tax equal to, let's just call it 9%. This is called an ad valorem tax. Ad valorem is the Latin word. It means according to value. The tax is according to value. I bought $100 worth of stuff, the government gets $9 of it, right? If you bought $1,000 worth of stuff, the government gets $90. So the tax is according to value. All right, so for this class, we can also have a per unit tax. And this is the one we use for class. A per unit tax. This is the simple one for class. We do a little bit of both, by the way, but for the most part, we're going to do a per unit tax because I think you'll cheer for this one. The math is a little bit easier to work with. So, woo, yeah. So the graph and the math, which are kind of one and the same, are a little bit easier to work with on a per unit tax. And these types of taxes are out there, it's possible, but most of them end up being a percentage. But the effects of it are about the same, as I'll show a little bit later. So we're not losing any insights by thinking about it being a per unit tax as opposed to a percentage of sale tax. So we're not losing much of the analysis. All right. So if let's just think about this free market situation. So we're supplying. What are we supplying today? Give me a good, any good, any good, any good. Flip-flops. Ooh, I like that. All right. So here's the flip-flop market. And flip-flop flip-flops are currently selling for, let's just say, 10 bucks. If the government comes along and says there's going to be a $1 per unit tax on flip-flops, what's likely to happen to the price of flip-flops tomorrow? If the government passes it today, what does the business owner do? Price goes up, right? Because the government, or because the producer now has this $1 tax that they have to pay. So if we're thinking about it a little bit differently. Now, another way to think about it is the dollar tax is paid for by the consumer. And so they go up to the cash register, oh, that's $10, but it's plus $1. But mentally, they're still shelling out $11 either way, right? So to them, it's $11. All right. So the producer, the seller, is going to try to pass the buck, so to speak, right? That's where the whole word pass the buck comes from. So if they were selling 100 flip-flops, let's say this is 100. If they were selling 100 flip-flops at a price of $10, how much revenue were they getting in the cash register each day? $100, right? Just kind of remember total revenue. When we think about maximizing profit, that's half of the equation. My sales in the cash register, total revenue, price, quantity, 10 times 100 is, or 10 times 100 is $1,000 worth of money in the cash register, and then I'd have my expenses. All right, so government passes a law, boom, sorry people, we're going to pass that dollar off to you. So I'm going to add $1 up to $11 now. So my new price of my product is 11. Under this example, let's just pretend that it's the seller that has to pay the tax of $1. So they just jack their prices up by $1. All right. So the new price tag when you walk into the store is $11 for the flip-flops. Tell me what goes on. Tell me what goes on with the story now. Yesterday we sold 100 flip-flops, and maybe on average we were selling 100 flip-flops, however you want to do it. We were selling 100 flip-flops at a price of $10. Government imposes the tax. I say no big deal. I'm just going to jack them up to 11, and then I'm still good. We'll just let those consumers pay the tax. What happens? Law of demand. And so what happens with it? Good. So as the price increases, they don't continue to sell 100, do they? Right? So that's the thing that people forget about, is if they try to just pass the buck, they're not going to sell 100 like they used to. The quantity or the law of demand is going to kick in, and they're only going to sell, I'm just making up numbers here again, but let's just say 75 units. And so they've got 25 unsold flip-flops at the price of $11. What did we call that from chapter 3? A surplus. Good, right? So we have a surplus. They jacked up the price to 11, but now they can't sell them all. They have a surplus of $25. What's our flip-flop store likely to do when they have excess inventory? Have a sale, right? They have a sale. Okay. So this is where the story gets kind of good. We can think about the supplier trying to pass the buck at all quantities. In other words, that tax has to be paid, otherwise they go to jail or whatever. And so that tax at 75 units has to be paid. That tax at 155 units has to be paid. So what we're really doing is kind of creating a new supply curve that's kind of what I call a fake supply curve. It's the supply curve of tax. And so what's happened is that the amount that's willing to be supplied to the market has been altered by the amount of the dollar tax. You see how we've shifted it up? And the amount of the money we've shifted it up by is the dollar tax. So that is $1 equal to the tax. All right, so where are we going to end up? After we've passed the tax legislation, the supplier tried to pass the buck. They had excess flip-flops. They found out they had to have a sale and decrease the price. Where do we end up? The new intersection here, right? So the new intersection shows the supply curve with the tax and consumer behavior is once again in equilibrium after the situation of the tax is established. So because of the way I drew the curves, let's just say that that ends up at $10.50. So flip-flops are now selling for $10.50. What is the actual price that the producer gets? $9.50 because they got to pay the tax, right? So that's why I call this the fake supply curve, because it shows the price plus the tax built into it. But ultimately what the business is going to base their behavior on is the amount that they get net. And so we have to take away the tax, which is now this red line that I'm showing. It was all shifted up by the amount of the tax. And so the price that the producer receives, PP, is $9.50. The price that the consumer paid, PC, the price that the consumer paid, PC, is $10.50. So at the end of the day, is the business able to pass the buck off to the consumer? No. So when the government says, I'm going to tax that big bad corporation, and they force the producer to pay the tax, do they end up paying all of the tax? No. Who pays the tax? Consumers or producers? Or both? It's shared, right? So that burden is shared by both consumers and producers. All right, so that is a kind of our first moral of the story, is that the tax gets paid, the $1 tax gets shared by consumers or producers, and it doesn't matter who we tax. Check this out. If I tell the story at the cash register of, well, we're just going to tax the consumer because we know that flip-flops are bad for your health, and so they won't mind paying $1 tax. If I do that, would it be appropriate to shift the demand curve down or up by the amount of the tax? If the government comes in and says, consumer, flip-flops are bad for you, kind of similar to cigarettes, so I'm going to tax flip-flops. Would it be appropriate to shift this down or up? Down or left. I know I've trained you on the left-right thing, and this is where it gets a little honest. But remember, I called this the fake demand curve and the fake supply curve? It's not a real shift. It's actually a shift according to some legislator, some bureaucrat who needed money for something, Lord knows what, and they decided to tax the market. You see how it's disconnected from flip-flop sales? It's not like they're trying to solve a flip-flop problem. They just needed money for something. Maybe it was something of value. I don't mean to be all poo-poo on the government. They have very valuable things that end up being shared. But let's face it, there's a few examples of government failure, right, on things that they buy or they spend too much on. So, you know, here they are entering the flip-flop market, who's a completely innocent flip-flop market. We can't think of anything wrong with the chemicals that go into the plastic used in the flip-flop, right? But that ends up getting shared. And so watch this. If I shift the demand curve down by the $1 tax, look at where we end up, right? So the vertical shift down by $1 leaves us here, right? And so we can tell the same story with whether the consumer gets taxed or whether the big bad producer gets taxed. Either way, we end up at the same spot. The consumer and the producer are going to share the tax. So this quantity is special. This quantity I call QT because it's the quantity after the tax. Whether we tax the consumer or whether we tax the producer, we end up with this situation. Consumers are paying higher prices, producers are getting lower prices, the government's getting a buck, and the quantity in the market is down relative to where it was in the free market. This quantity is, again, I'm just making up numbers, this might not be perfect, but in fact, I probably was dumb to put this, because now you guys are going to get me on Rise Over Run. Maybe I need to make this 85. Maybe we could do it. I don't want to think that hard. Let's say this is 80. Just making up numbers. It's wrong with the linear. I don't want to do the Rise Over Run right now. That's not the point. If this is 80, then we've lost 20 units being exchanged, right? And this is the situation. All right, so what is this area? What is this rectangle equal to? Think about the area of that rectangle. It equals something significant. The dollars that the government gets, right? So that's the tax revenue. Tax revenue, not the per unit tax, but the tax revenue. So in this case, how much is the government collecting? Not $1, not the rectangle, $80, right? There's 80 units being exchanged in the market, and the government's collecting $1 on each one. So literally the area of this rectangle is the amount of tax revenue. Tax revenue equals little t times QT, which is $1 times 80 units equals $80 for this problem. So there's $80 identified in this red rectangle. The distance was the amount of the per unit tax, little t. And that's our story of the tax. Questions? Now, tax is good or bad? Depends. I like that answer. Okay, good. I did definitely lock that one up for you to smash out of the park. All right, depends on what? That's the even tougher part. I didn't see who spoke. Who said depends? Who said depends? Okay. What does it depend on? Give me your name again. Savannah.
I guess it depends on.
Okay, good. I like that answer, Savannah. That's very good. You know, what's this money being used for? Is kind of the main thing. Are we feeding the hungry, and are we educating the hungry on how to make themselves better, or are we fighting poverty? Are we buying weapons of mass destruction? What is the money being used for? Is an important part to that to the answer to that question. As an economist, what we bring to the table is to say, hey, listen, I can identify. I don't know if this tax is good or bad or the other. I mean, that's somewhat maybe a political battle. I think it should go towards this. I think it should go towards this. I feel this is more important in life than this, right? The economist tends to stay out of those battles. That is truly more political science and politics. The economist has the science or the quantitative reasoning to bring to the table how much is at stake. And one of the things that is especially true of economists bringing something to the table is this. What is that? Deadweight loss, right? So deadweight loss was an amount of consumer or producer surplus that we had from chapter 5, right? Remember, this whole rectangle used to be consumer and producer. It was somebody's benefit. It was somebody's welfare or well-being is what we had. Consumer surplus, producer surplus. Now, boom, we add the tax. And what is the consumer surplus now? Up, right? because the consumers are paying $10.50. Remember, our definition for consumer surplus is the difference between what we were willing to pay and what we actually paid for each unit consumed. We're consuming 80 units. Somebody down here was willing to pay this amount, but they actually paid $10.50. Willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual, all the way out to the 80 units I consume. So my new consumer surplus area is right there. Producers have producer surplus where it's the difference between the price they actually got, $9.50 in this case, and the minimum price they must get for each unit that they produce. They produce and sell 80 units under the tax regime. So here's the minimum, or here's what they actually get, $9.50 minus the minimum. Actual, minimum, actual, minimum, actual, minimum, actual, minimum, actual, minimum, all the way out to 80 units. This area ends up being the producer surplus after the tax. So the thing that we're introducing now into this welfare analysis that we didn't do in Chapter 5 is thinking about the pie, if you will, and where that money goes, adding the government into the picture. The government is now collecting the red rectangle. So now we've got three players that we're concerned about: consumers, producers, and government. Our important takeaway is this deadweight loss nobody gets. The government doesn't get it, the consumers don't get it, the producers don't get it. It vanishes. It disappears because we're no longer at the allocatively efficient quantity that we were at before. Okay, questions or comments? Yes?
So, is it safe to say that keep supply of demand falling?
No, it's not fair to say that. And so I'll tell you why. So the ceteris paribus assumption has not left us. So the only way that, Kylo's question was, does the demand and supply continue to fall because of the tax, right? Is that, so if I heard you right, you're like, does this continue to move because of it? And we're still following our law of demand and law of supply with the ceteris paribus. So we're saying, ceteris paribus, suppose the government implements a tax. This is the situation. We would observe a permanent fall to 80, and then we'd be done with that analysis. Now, if we can get more elaborate with it by relaxing some of the ceteris paribus assumptions. So suppose that the tax increased because there was a new president. Hillary's the one that's promoting more taxes, more so than Trump, although I think he'll end up raising taxes too. But probably if we have the battle of raising taxes, Hillary would vote for more tax increases than Trump. So if the story we told was, this was the first move of Hillary's new regime, that's the effect. But what might you expect knowing that she's got a 4-year run, possibly an 8-year run? What might you start to expect 2 years now, or with your income taxes, or with other things? They're going up too, right? So what shifter does that fall onto the demand shifters? Expectations, right? My expected income or my expected taxes, because if my expected taxes go up, my expected income falls, right? So expectations might start to cause this effect that you're talking about, but from an economic analysis, ceteris paribus, this is the effect, we're done, unless we start relaxing some other things. Okay, good question. Anybody else? All right, so that is the tax. The next thing I want to add on, or not add on, but do, is the subsidy, because it's very similar to the tax. So number 2 is a subsidy. And a subsidy is a monetary sum given for some activity. or to someone. A monetary sum, so we're talking money now, not food or clothing, but actual money, because we're going to analyze it in our supply and demand framework. A monetary sum for some activity. And so I already gave you probably the best example you guys can relate to, and that would be education. Education for college, the Pell Grant. But then we can also get into subsidized loans and other sorts of fancy. These all amount to some sort of gift of money. When the government does a subsidy, are they intending to encourage or discourage the activity? Encourage, right? So we're looking to encourage the activity. So we are looking to encourage the activity, the behavior. Tax discouraged the activity. That might not have been the intent always, but it tends to discourage. We had a talk about cigarettes costing $15 in Chicago, Illinois. Why? Because the tax was probably $10 at least. And so those goods that are deemed in our culture to be bad for you or bad or negative or sinful or whatever, they tend to be more easily passed in the legislature. It's like, oh, you shouldn't be smoking anyway, so yeah, let's collect some taxes for that, right? Okay, so back to home base. Draw a home base real quick. We'll start with a fresh graph. So there's our free market starting place. And for this one, I want to show you a new technique that you can actually use over here. So I'm gonna show you first on the tax situation. The tax is sometimes referred to as the tax wedge. Why? Because it creates a wedge between the price consumers pay and the price producers receive. And you can almost envision this tax revenue being like a big log, a big wedge of wood or something. But that's the tax wedge. And so the edge of the wedge is this vertical height that's equal to the tax. And so what I want to do for the subsidy, which is also a tax, imagine if we implemented a tax over here, we would float in and then the edge of the wedge would be the height of that amount. Where the old demand curve and the old supply curve are, that's what's going on. Check it out. There's the old supply curve, there's the old demand curve, and the edge of the wedge now is the amount of the tax. A subsidy looks to encourage production, and so a subsidy comes to us from the other side. And we come floating in here. So until it gets wedged in there. And at this wedge, I want to need my marker. The edge of the wedge is the amount of the subsidy now. So this is the per unit subsidy. And so maybe this is, let's see, how about we've got a $200 per credit hour education. Actually, I want that to be a little higher. Let me take that back. Without any subsidy, the equilibrium price would be $500. So let's suppose that we've got education running $100 if we just had no government intervention, no grants, no subsidies. Ottawa University is a private college, right? we don't get any state funds in or federal funds directly to run this institution. So we are a private college. Now the government has dug their claws into private institutions by heavily subsidizing students through student loans and through Pell Grants and other things. And so that has encouraged, so part of your tuition is being paid by the government now, not all your own funds, right? Which is good for private institutions like Ottawa, in that that has a consumer now with a higher willingness to pay for the product, because normally you wouldn't be able to afford the $500 per credit hour. But now that Uncle Sam says, hey, if you go to college, you pick wherever you want. You could go to KU, you could go to K-State, or you could go to Ottawa. I don't care where you go. You're going to get a certain amount of money. Some of you might select to come to Ottawa, right? And so with that subsidy, what happens is the demand curve tells us the new price that the consumer or the student is going to pay. So the bottom part of the wedge tells us now PC, the price that the consumer pays. And the top part of the wedge touches the supply curve, telling you PP, the price, I'm going to summarize all these little acronyms in a little bit here too, by the way. PP is the price producer receives. This is the price Ottawa gets, right? So Ottawa gets PP, but the consumer only pays PC. And so from the consumer standpoint, their tuition has dropped down to, let's call it $400 per credit hour. And Ottawa is now getting $600 per credit hour. If we have, let's say, a per unit subsidy of $200 per credit hour. At the end of the day, this higher 600 allows Ottawa University to service more students, right? Because our current student base was 600 students, and now with the subsidy, we're able to cover 700 students. So we've, in that regard, achieved our objective of education, that we want maybe more smart people running around the earth than dumb people, and so because there's less crime and other good things that come from economic growth, you guys are more productive for society, you find jobs, you have families, whatever. We have increased the quantity by 100 students at Ottawa. And so these are the overall effects from the subsidy. All right, questions so far on that? What is this area? Let me put it in a different color. What is this sucker? Tax revenue, government revenue? So that they spent on the program or that they collected? Government spending or government tax revenue? Spending, right? So here, they collected money. Here, they've spent money. So this is total government expenditure. Government expenditure, government spending. And it is equal to government expenditure, GE, is equal to the amount of the per unit subsidy times the quantity after the subsidy. So we got 700 times $200 equals how much government expenditure went on for this program? 700 units of schooling going on with a $200 subsidy, 14 something, 140,000. We got two zeros to contend with, right? So we got two zeros, and then we got a couple more zeros, and then we've got a 14. So what do we got there? $140,000 of government spending went on in the form of grants to facilitate this program. So this is 140,000 is the $200 subsidy times the 700 units that were done after the tax. Ooh, great question. I'm going to save that one for later. The answer is yes, but it's not quite as easy to, well, maybe I should. Maybe we'll see. So the question was, is there any dead weight loss with this? Is there any dead weight loss? I think I will save that one for later because it takes a little bit more analysis, but the short answer is yes. The short answer is yes. And it's actually kind of fun to calculate, but we're gonna, when we do this one, we'll do it here. We'll do it here. But I need to spend a little more time nurturing that one. So the answer is yes, there is a dead weight loss, but I'm not gonna show you right now. Okay, any other questions, whether they're good and whether I will give you an answer or not? Okay, so tax, subsidy, you kind of see why it's a negative tax. It kind of just works the opposite of a tax, right? Instead of discouraging, we encourage it. Instead of collecting money, we give money. But the whole mechanics of it are very similar. Does it matter if we give the money to the company, we give the money to Ottawa University, or we give the money to the consumer? Will that make a difference? Same thing going on there. Check it out. If I give you $200, your demand curve goes up by the amount of the $200. The fake demand curve and the real supply curve are intersect here. Analysis follows. Same thing. QS is here. If I give the money to Ottawa University, that makes it cheaper to run their business. It shifts down by the amount of the subsidy, and the rest of the analysis follows. Right? You go back to the real supply curve and the real demand curve to calculate all of that. So PP and PC all stay the same. All right, let me write out some of these notations that I did here. Okay, so notes for tax/subsidy. All right, PC equals the price consumers pay post-tax subsidy. In other words, after the tax, post-tax subsidy. PC is the price consumers pay. PP is the price producers receive post-sales tax subsidy. T, little t, is the amount of the per unit tax. Little s is the per unit subsidy. QT is the quantity after tax. QS equals quantity after subsidy. Big T equals little t times QT. That was our tax revenue. Tax revenue collected by the government. GE, government expenditure. The amount of the per unit subsidy times the quantity after the subsidy. is the government spending. Total government spending on the subsidy. Everybody caught us? No, no. There's other government interventions we're going to talk about. So this was just this is kind of one of the big ones, is analyzing the tax. I got one more to throw at you here. It's a modification of T. Maybe we could put this. Yeah, let me throw this one up here. T is equal to PC minus PP. You might need that one on a homework exercise or a test. After you write down the formula, just come back over to the graph and hopefully it makes sense. PC 1050 minus PP, the 950 equals the dollar tax, right? So it's the wedge. It's the difference between what the is and what the producer receives. All right, so one of our key takeaways from this, key point, is that the consumer and producer always share the tax. So no matter who is taxed, no matter if consumers or producers, no matter if consumers or producers are taxed, no matter if consumers or producers are taxed, they will share the tax. According to the relative elasticities of demand and supply. I know that's the new one I'm laying on you, but we did elasticities last week. There's a connection here that I'm going to show you in a sec, but write this key point down. This is a great multiple choice question. No matter if the consumers or producers are taxed, they will ultimately share the tax according to the relative elasticity in demand and elasticity of supply. I mean, it almost makes me cringe when politicians say that they're going to tax corporations. Oh, well, we'll just raise corporate income tax. Who cares? You know, then we'll be just sucking it to the rich anyway. But what that misses the boat on is that the consumers of the goods that purchase stuff from that corporation are also going to pay part of that tax, right? This is a powerful lesson here on taxes. You can't just pass the buck to one or the other. Economics tells us those two groups are going to share the burden of the tax. So one kicker that you might start to pick up on once in a while is that they'll sometimes pass a tax on stuff that more proportionately affects the poor people. Gasoline is one. If you are living in poverty and you have a job, but you're just scraping by, what fraction of your income does gasoline make? Your gasoline spending relative to your income, right? Compared to the person who's making $100,000 a year. So if you're making $15,000 a year and you're commuting to your your job, scraping by, versus the person who's making $100,000 a year, possible that they have the same amount of commute. Agreed?
Yeah.
So they live in a town and they go to work. So if gas is taxed heavily, who ends up bearing the greater burden of that gas tax? The person in poverty or the person making $100,000? The person in poverty. We have those sorts of situations going on in the United States all the time because people aren't careful and thinking about how those taxes are impacting the people that are involved in it. And so those sorts of things go on, and that's part of what economists do, analyze the impacts of different policies that are out there. And so I think the most important lesson for a principal student to take away from this class is that it's always going to be shared. It's not good enough to just say we're going to tax the rich or tax the corporation or the business, or we're going to tax the consumer in some cases. It always is going to be shared. All right, so what's this relative elasticity business? If this demand curve becomes more inelastic, does it get steeper or flatter? Steeper, right? It starts to look like an eye. So what I'm going to do is rotate this through our starting point. If we apply the same tax I did here with the same graph, the same numbers, who pays the greater burden of the tax now? The consumers or the producers? I had it evenly split before. Who pays the greater burden of the tax? Consumers or producers? I got a little bit of an angle on it. So I'm taking this demand curve, and the only thing I'm doing is I'm making it more inelastic. Producers? How is PP and PC changing? Try to visualize this. I know you guys are just got introduced to this, unless you happen to read ahead. Don't worry about consumer surplus, just focus in on PC. What happens to PC compared to where it is right now? Does it go up or down? It goes up. Check it out. The new intersection point is here. PC went up. What happened to PP? It up? Does that help producers or hurt them more? It helps them. They like higher prices. So as PP starts to drift up, if we think about the rectangle here as the amount of money consumers paid versus the amount of money producers paid, right? We didn't talk about it that way before, but we said the consumers are paying 50 cents, the producers are paying 50 cents, they're splitting it even. With this new situation, we have consumers paying a larger fraction of the tax revenue, right? So the burden of tax has gone up for the consumers and actually gone down for the producers. What happened to deadweight loss, though? What happened to deadweight loss? Bigger?
Small.
It actually got smaller. So if I do this is where I kind of like the tax wedge a little bit more. So with the new, ooh, I can rest my arm. Ooh, I kind of like this stuff. I've never done this before. All right, so there we go. There's the new demand curve. Using the tax wedge method this time, we float into the marketplace, staying below the demand curve, above the supply curve, and our little friendly tax wedge just kind of comes floating in here until it gets wedged in here, right? And so now the top part of the wedge touches the supply curve here, showing you PC. The bottom part of the wedge touches here, telling you PP. Well, compared to $10, the producers are taking less of a hit, right? They're taking less of a hit. And now check out the triangle area. The triangle area is now this little guy right in here. So the deficit has actually shrunk because what happened to QT? Did it go up or down? It went up closer to the free market quantity. And that's what really drives the result of deadweight loss, is this. In fact, if demand was perfectly inelastic, how much deadweight loss is there? None. Who pays the tax? Consumers pay 100% of the tax. Now we're right here. Producers are getting what they did before. Consumers are paying everything. So that answer starts to change, not just by the elasticity of demand, but also the elasticity of supply. Watch what happens when I make the supply curve more elastic. I should have tested you guys to make sure you have that. Suppose the supply curve looks like this. Old demand curve, this supply curve. Who pays more of the tax? Consumers or producers? Consumers still do, right? So, right in there. Consumers' price or producer price went down by a little bit. Consumers absorbed most of the the tax. All right, so this statement here, no matter if the consumers or producers are taxed, they will share the tax according to the relative, underline the word relative, elasticity of demand versus supply. And then let's draw 4 quickies. Draw 4 graphs. Don't put home base in, just draw P's and Q's. But draw four graphs. And on the top part, if you want to draw a really steep demand curve, and maybe just some sort of regular old supply curve. And then on the one to the right, you can draw a steep supply curve and some sort of regular old demand curve. It doesn't really matter how, just kind of try to exaggerate the slope as much as you can so that it's not even Steven like we've been doing. Leave the bottom 2 for now. And then just do your tax analysis. Throw in a tax, I don't care how it is, but try to practice current equilibrium, free market equilibrium under these circumstances is P star in each case. And then give yourself enough room. You can make your tax kind of obnoxious and then it's easier to see. Draw vertical height. The top part of the tax wedge touches the demand curve, tells you PC. The bottom part touches the supply curve, tells you PP. The consumer price has gone up by the difference here, which is this upper portion of the total tax revenue. Whereas the producer's price has only gone down by this lower portion. And so on some of your homework and tests, you might have to identify the burden of tax. The total tax is the whole rectangle. This is the consumer burden, the top part. The consumer burden, that's how much they have to pay. And the bottom part is the producer burden, how much they have to pay from the tax. All right, so questions on the setup on this one, and then I'll throw some other cases at you. You can practice. I'll walk around the room and see how you're doing. You get the general gist of it, depending on the flatness or steepness? Okay, so now go ahead and for this one down on the low, let me draw in some lower ones. Let's make supply perfectly elastic, perfectly flat, and some old demand curve. And then how about a perfectly inelastic demand curve and some regular old supply curve? Make sure in each case you identify the original equilibrium price and the original equilibrium quantity, which I got a little sloppy on here. I didn't even do that. Q star. And then the quantity after the tax, QT. And now you've got all the pieces of the puzzle that we did on this chart here identified. We didn't kind of put all of the tax revenue, but we shaded it. Basically, it's highlighting all of that. So do that for each of these three cases. I'll walk around the room. And see how you did. So do these other three cases on your own. This one. About that tax wedge floating in there. And so I heard, but yeah, you got it. You guys in the back, there's multiple seats up on this side so that you can see. If you want to move right now, why don't you come over, because I need to kind of work the board, especially you guys against that far side. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 seats just along this wall. I'm sure your partner or person next to you will be willing to give you a little elbow room. Okay, Hunzi, Jackie, can you hold up your papers? Let me see what you got. Okay. All right. Jackie. Okay, so you didn't do the other ones yet, right? Okay. Hunzi, you were filling in too many things. So make sure that you got the height of the tax being up here. You were filling in like the whole triangle, and that was from last time. Okay, see that? All right, so I'll just do kind of quick and dirty here. So again, float your boat in. It doesn't matter how tall it is. Vertical. Top part touches the demand curve. Bottom part touches the supply curve. Tells you PP and PC. And then you'll start, I'm not going to fill in all of the blanks here. Float in your tax wedge, staying above the supply curve, below the demand curve. In this case, who pays the tax? Consumer pays it all, right? So PP equals P star. So that one, the consumer pays it all. And in this one, stay above the supply curve, below the demand curve, get stuck in here. And in this case, the consumer pays it all, and the producer is unharmed. So notice both these cases down below, we get the same result, but for different reasons. So in this case, demand was perfectly inelastic, caused the whole price to go up. And here, demand was just relatively more inelastic compared to supply. Supply happened to be perfectly elastic, so we ended up with the same result. So that's where this word relative is important. It's always one curve relative to the other. This is a very rare occasion I'm going to pull both golf clubs so that you guys can, I can hopefully drive home this point. Let's go back to this one. Watch this. If I start to make this one steeper, consumers pay more. But if at the same time this becomes steeper, they're back to paying equal. This one gets steeper, producers pay more, but if this one gets steeper, they both pay equal, right? So it's always one relative to the other. In other words, it's not one all by itself. You can't just say, oh, well, demand is inelastic, so they're going to pay more. That depends on the supply. Because if the supply curve looks like this, suppliers pay everything. It's always one relative to the other. The elasticity of demand versus the elasticity of supply. Okay, questions or comments there? As either curve gets steeper, though, the more that we get the quantity getting closer to the allocatively efficient quantity, the less dead weight loss. The dead weight loss starts to disappear. So in general, from an economist standpoint, it is better to tax cocaine as opposed to milk. Although milk's pretty inelastic too. Might not have been the best example, but it's better to tax booze instead of breakfast cereal. Just based on elasticity alone, because the more inelastic a good is, the less dead weight loss there will be. So at least we're being more efficient in terms of dead weight loss. We're minimizing dead weight loss by taking goods that are more inelastic, either in supply or demand. So that's a good part, and it doesn't matter which one it is. But that brings up the issue of efficiency versus equity. What does equity mean? That's kind of a mysterious word sometimes. I think we've hammered efficiency quite a bit, but one of your chapters also talked about equity. If a solution is equitable, what is it? Profitable? No, not so much. We're not talking about monetary stuff in this context. You're right. Equity, net worth, we could be talking about money, but in this case we're not. If a resolution seemed equitable between two people who had a dispute, what was it? Equal for both, fair, right? So it wasn't necessarily even Steven with equal shares, but it seemed fair, like a fair vision of whatever the solution was. So if somebody comes off with something that they think, well, that's a pretty equitable solution, it seemed fair. Well, economists struggle with fairness. Again, we kind of leave that, we don't struggle with maybe quantifying it, but we're not here to say this person's right and this person's wrong. But we will kind of set the parameters, and that's what separates economics maybe from some other social studies and from political science, is that we're going to provide tools to people so that they see the efficiency aspects, and also tools to maybe measure the equity in terms of consumer and producer surplus, but not to the point where we say, this should be done here and this should be done here because that would be more fair. That's kind of, for the most part, in another discipline, in another area, okay? But we're not away from that always either, so we can always still hold our own personal opinions on how we think the world should work. Okay, all right, I think we beat taxes and subsidies to a T. All right, let's look at our quota next. Let's look at our quota. So what is a quota? Some of you had macro class, and some of you might just know what it is anyway. What is a quota? If there's a quota, what kind of restriction or requirement is it? A minimum, what? Price or quantity? Right, it's a quantity. So a quota, in terms of international trade, it seems to be a hot button between Hillary and Trump, both of them questionable on their trade policies, I guess, in terms of free trade. But a quota is a restriction on the quantity. So if we want to reduce trade with China on plastic toys because we think that their government has been making their money a little too cheap and not being fair to our workers of little plastic junky toys that we don't need, then we can say, all right, we normally have been doing 100,000 of these plastic toys, but now we're only going to allow 50,000, right? So at the border, we're going to restrict the quantity sold. That's what a quota is. So a quota, so this is number 3, I think, on our list. So back to doing our list. Okay, I burned out my blue. A quota is a legal restriction on quantity. And it's really a legal maximum. They don't care if you're under it, but the restriction is the only so much, a legal restriction on quantity. And so again, draw a home base. If we're back to our plastic toy market here, and we're currently importing 100,000 units, one way to think about it is to say, okay, fine. By law, our quota is going to be 50. So here is the quota. So our little junky plastic toys, we're selling for $7 on average per toy. What is the impact of a restriction on quantity in the market? So a lot of these are similar to what we did in chapter last week with your module 2. What happens to price and quantity? What goes down? Price or quantity or what? Price goes up, quantity goes down. So here's where we started with the free market. And now, if this is the legal maximum, assuming people aren't breaking the law, if they're staying lawful, then the most there can be is 50. And so what's that going to do to price? I heard some people bring it down, or does it drive the price up? Price up for the consumer or price up for the producer? That's a tricky one all of a sudden. Wait a second, you're pulling a punch on us here. Price for the consumer? Definitely, right? So PC, the consumer price goes up. But what about the producer price? Stay the same, goes down. It actually goes up too. And here's why. The supply curve with the quota is the old supply curve right here. No problems there. But then effectively, what does the supply become? Yep, I saw somebody point up, right? We can't supply anymore. So the effective supply curve is now this. It got kinky on us. So this is the supply curve with the quota. Kind of like a fake supply curve and the real supply curve. The real supply curve is still kind of sitting here, but the effective supply curve with the quota system is the squiggly line. It gets kind of kinky on us. And so the price that the producers receive is whatever this turns out to be. I'm just again, so let's just say it's $9. And so the price of the plastic toys have gone up in the country. Where this story, again, we won't get into the details like macro, but if we had American producers and Chinese producers and they're both doing plastic toys that are pretty good substitutes for each other, then this would be the market with both China and American plastic toys in the market. We cut off the Chinese, we restrict the supply, American producers are going to enjoy this price increase on their toys too. Is kind of the story that goes on. All right, so questions on the quota. Restriction on quantity.
And the weight loss.
Good, yes, deadweight loss. Here's where we were, here's the quantity with the quota. And so we end up with this little triangular region. If we go back to where we started with the free market compared to what we are at today, there's our deadweight loss. Consumer surplus, the difference between what the consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. Willing, actual, willing, actual, willing, actual. So consumers took a hit because of the quota. Because of the government policy, Americans are paying more for plastic toys, right? Producers, on the other hand, the difference between what they're actually getting and the minimum. Actual, minimum, actual, minimum, actual, minimum, actual, minimum. So the producer surplus is this trapezoidal area. So producers had a win loss. Remember, they had this area of the triangle before. So they gained this, but they lost this. So if this is bigger than this, then they experience the gain, which is probably likely given our numbers, but it actually doesn't have to be that way. It's possible that this little triangle could be bigger than the rectangle that they gained. And you'll have some exercises. We'll kind of touch more on that later as well. I just kind of want to lay all these out for you at this point. Okay. Number 4. Regulations. So the government passes a law with safety standards, environmental standards, etc. Some sort of regulation, some sort of policy, whatever the reason for the policy was, we'll talk more about that later. But right now, I just want to get through the economics of and analyzing the impact of that. So, supply and demand, home base, demand, supply. Free market, no regulation, or no change in regulation is another way to think about it. There's our home base. Consumer surplus up top, this triangular region, producer surplus downstairs. What happens to the situation when new regulations are passed by the producers that there's certain safety standards? You always got to have a whole set of eye goggles just in case somebody gets splashed in the eye, or a special wash basin to wash your hands if chemicals get on it. But you can't have one of them. You need to have every 10 feet in this building. So we don't want people to have to walk too far. So the government thought it would be good to have one here, and one here. Even though some people say, well, we only need one. Let's just make it a bigger one where we can share it. They said, no. We have to have it at each station. There's got to be 3 of them. What happens in terms of the supply curve when there's increased regulation such as that? Supply, right? Supply shifts to the left, to the right, to the left. So we're essentially doing what in terms of our shifters? What shifter are we affecting when we think about supply curve shifting to the left? What's going up? What's our shifter list? We got expectations, number of suppliers, price of resources, price of resources, price of resources, right? So if the government, if we used to run our books, here's an calculation for you. If the way we used to run our software, we used to have a stack of papers this big that covered all of our financials, but now the government makes it be this big. I'm spending more money on paper. I'm spending more money on processing, right? So my cost of doing business have gone up, likely due to the regulation. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes it might have created a new industry, which happens all the time off of government regulation. There might be new industries that come about from it. But from our analysis here, the supply curve with regulation shifts to the left, shifts up. Again, now you guys are kind of moving into phase 2 of your analysis. You can kind of think about those two things similar. But there's an increase in costs, or the price of resources. Price consumers pay, price producers receive. Is there a wedge? Is there a difference between the two? Price PP and PC. No difference this time, right? So think about it. The company's paying for the extra paper, the extra processing. They might have had to hire a specialist to dot all the I's and cross all the T's for the government regulation. Higher safety standards, more things, more water used, whatever the case is. All of that was kind of like a cost of doing business. It was just dictated by the government. You had to do it. If you want to operate a U.S. business, you have to follow these laws or you find yourself in jail. And so the consumer's price goes up, the producer price goes up. But that's not all gravy to the producer, right? Because now they're using that increase in price to pay the higher costs. So there is kind of a separation between the two. So with regulation, we do get, let's call it Q-reg. Quantity goes down, dead weight loss. Still get a dead weight loss. All right, number 5, a price ceiling. A price ceiling is a legal max on price instead of quantity. A quota is a legal max on quantity. A price ceiling is a legal maximum on price. So example, 2-bedroom apartment. We intend to help students by setting the ceiling at 500 when market price is 800. Let's help out those poor students. We're going to set a law. Those greedy landlords, they got enough money. They don't need all that. That rent's way too high. Are you kidding me? Look at these kids. They're struggling to pay their tuition and stay in school. So let's just set a maximum price of 500. All right? Analyze it. Home base, free market, upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. Our equilibrium price in a free market was $800. Quantity I don't really care about. Let's just say it was 1,000 units. We're in the market for 2-bedroom apartments. So the ceiling price is at 500. P ceiling. with a ceiling in place, is there going to be more or less than 1,000 units being exchanged in the market? With a ceiling of $500 maximum price, is there going to tend to be more apartments on board or less apartments on board? Less. Because at 500, landlords are only going to supply this amount. Of course, lots of students would love to get an apartment at 500, but they're just not available. What does that create from chapter 3? A shortage. There'll be a shortage of apartments is our prediction long term with a price ceiling. So there's going to be a shortage. And that shortage normally disappears on market circumstances. What happens to prices when there's a shortage if it's a free market? Do they go up or down? They go up, right? So in the face of a shortage, prices would normally rise, but they can't because it's the law. The law was passed that the apartments need to be 500 at most. All right, kissing cousin to the price ceiling is the price floor. This will be our last one for today. So number 6 is a price floor. It is a legal minimum on price. Probably the most famous of these, we're going to switch on you and say this is the quantity of labor. I don't usually do this, but I kind of feel like doing it today. And the price is actually the wage. We have the demand for labor. I've switched on you. This is businesses now, right? So don't be confused. Businesses want to buy labor hours. The supply curve is you and households, workers, potential workers, households. So we've switched roles. Under a free market, for a low to no skill job, we would come in, let's say, at, I don't know, $6 in our labor market. And with a wage $6, there would be 1,000 people working in our community. Government comes in and says, hey, you can't live on $6. That's way too low. Let's impose a minimum wage of $9. If there's a minimum wage of $9, is there going to be more or less than 1,000 people working? Less. So at a wage of $9, businesses are going to find substitutes or have to lay some people off for these low to no skill jobs. And so the quantity is going to fall to here. Of course, lots of people would love to go work for that amount. There's no denying that. That would be in a perfect world that didn't obey the laws of economics. But that creates a surplus of workers, otherwise known as, in the labor market, what do we call a surplus of workers? People who are wanting and willing to work but can't find a job. It's the unemployed. And then that's going to cause a permanent surplus or unemployed workers, because normally in a free market, wages would fall to get back to equilibrium. But now we're going to stay there. All right, so that covers all the bases. We will pick up there. Remember to bring your sheets next time. These worksheets that are, it's on your MyEcon Lab, buckets and circular flows. If you want, you can just print off that one. We're going to be working through that right when we start next time.
Is there an attendance sheet?
Attendance sheet, yes, there is. Thank you. Let's sign the attendance sheet. I don't know. I've got a 1 o'clock. Yeah, it would. Okay, so let me stop recording here.